Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going back in time,
Okay.
back to Tudor England. And we're
Yeah.
not here to talk about all the wives that Henry VIII had,
Right.
but that could be fun for another time.
Definitely.
We're tackling something much bigger today,
Okay.
something that completely changed
Yes.
English life.
Uh-huh.
The dissolution of the monasteries. You might think you know this story,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
trust me, there are layers here
Yeah.
that will absolutely surprise you.
That's true. Well, many people focus on the drama of the break from Rome.
Right.
The dissolution had an even deeper impact
Yes.
on everyday people.
Yeah.
Just imagine if your local church, your hospital, even the schoolhouse were suddenly gone, and all their resources were absorbed by the crown.
Yeah.
That's the reality that many people in England faced.
That's a pretty stark image.
It is.
And to kind of guide us through this,
Yes.
we've got some really fascinating sources. We're drawing on historians like Alec Ryrie and James Clark,
Mm-hmm.
but also these incredible firsthand accounts,
Yes.
like signatures on the deeds of surrender.
Yeah.
It's like history is whispering to us
Yes.
directly across the centuries.
Those signatures are especially poignant.
Really?
You can practically feel the weight of the decision
Oh, wow.
in every stroke of the quill.
Okay, so before we get into those personal stories, let's set the scene.
Okay.
Dissolving monasteries wasn't totally new, was it?
Right.
I mean, even Cardinal Wolsey
Yes.
repurposed some
It did.
to fund those ambitious projects of his.
Right, which highlights how adaptable
Okay.
these institutions were.
Yeah.
Their role in society
Yeah.
wasn't fixed.
Right, yeah.
And that probably made them much more vulnerable when
no.
Henry VIII came along.
Yep.
But make no mistake, Henry's dissolution was different.
Okay.
It was on a scale and with an aggression
Yes.
that's more comparable to what happened in Sweden. This wasn't just like a reshuffling.
Right.
It was a complete upheaval,
Okay.
driven by this potent mix of power, money, anxieties about national security, and of course the looming Reformation.
Let's talk about the money aspect for a moment.
Okay.
You'd think that Henry would go straight for the wealthiest monasteries,
Right.
but he actually targeted the poorer ones first.
He did.
Why would he do that?
Well, that's where you see Henry's strategic thinking.
Okay.
Think about it. The smaller,
Uh-huh.
less influential monasteries had much less political clout.
Right.
So there was less organized resistance.
Makes sense.
Plus, there were a lot of them.
Oh, yeah.
So by taking their assets, even if they were individually smaller,
Right.
the
Yeah.
crown could very quickly accumulate a pretty hefty sum.
So it's a bit like going for quantity over quality,
It is.
but it's pretty ruthless when you think about the people involved.
Absolutely. And let's not forget Henry's paranoia about invasions
Yeah.
from Catholic powers like France and Spain.
Mm-hmm.
He really needed a war chest.
Yeah.
And quickly,
Yeah.
that military buildup kind of adds another dimension to why he was so determined
Okay.
to strip the monasteries of their wealth.
Right.
He could claim that it was for the good of the realm,
Yeah.
even if self-preservation was the real driver.
So we're already seeing how intertwined those political and economic motives were.
Mm-hmm.
But the dissolution wasn't just about earthly power, was it?
It wasn't.
It triggered a spiritual earthquake as well,
Yes.
particularly when it comes to deeply ingrained beliefs
Uh-huh.
about praying for the dead and navigating purgatory.
Right.
The monasteries were at the heart of that system for many people.
They were, and that's where things get complicated. You see, Henry himself was rather ambiguous on the doctrine of purgatory.
Really?
He seemed to want to dismantle the infrastructure surrounding it
Right.
without necessarily tackling the theology head on.
So imagine trying to take down a building,
Yeah.
but leaving those blueprints up for debate.
Yeah.
That kind of ambiguity
Yes.
must have created a lot of anxiety
It
for
did.
people trying to make sense of their faith
Mm-hmm.
in this new landscape.
Exactly. It reflects this delicate tightrope the crown was walking,
Yeah.
trying to reshape religious practice without alienating the masses entirely.
Right.
But what about those individuals who are most directly affected?
Okay.
What happened to all the monks and nuns who suddenly found themselves without a home, a purpose, a community?
It's a question that often gets overlooked when we talk about these sweeping historical events.
It does.
So we tend to focus on the big picture.
Right.
But behind these grand narratives are real people
Yes.
whose lives were completely upended.
Absolutely. And their stories are often quite moving.
Really?
For instance, many of the monks from Fountains Abbey,
Okay.
they didn't just scatter to the winds,
Yeah.
they settled near one another,
Oh, wow.
even referencing their former brothers in their wills.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's as if they were clinging to their shared past, even as their physical world was crumbling around them.
There's a real resilience there.
There is.
And for the nuns,
Yes.
things were even more challenging.
Yes, they were.
Social norms during Henry VIII's reign dictated that they remain chaste.
Right.
Which left them in a very precarious position.
It did.
What were their options?
Their options were indeed limited.
Yeah.
But their resourcefulness is remarkable.
Really?
Some pooled their resources.
Okay.
They formed households together.
Right.
They found strength in their shared experiences. They adapted their monastic life to fit a world that no longer had a designated space for them.
Yeah, it's a testament to their determination.
It is.
They weren't going to let Henry VIII completely erase their way of life.
Right.
Now, you mentioned earlier how the dissolution wasn't this perfectly orchestrated plan.
Yes.
And I think the story of Godstow Abbey really brings that home.
It does.
Here was this well-run nunnery.
Yes.
Led by the well-connected Lady Catherine, a woman who really embraced reform.
She did.
And yet they still faced closure.
Yes.
What do you make of that?
Well, Godstow really throws a wrench into any simplistic narrative about the dissolution.
Okay.
It demonstrates this capricious and often unpredictable nature of Henry's reign.
Yeah.
Even those who appeared to be on the right side of the Reformation weren't necessarily safe.
Right.
It's a reminder that this wasn't just about religious purity.
Okay.
Or even straightforward greed.
Yeah.
Power was always in play.
It makes you wonder if anyone really felt secure during that time.
I think that's a valid point.
Now, here's something I find fascinating.
Okay.
Lady Catherine's reforms actually went further than Henry's in some ways.
They did.
What does that tell us about the complexities?
Well, it's a great illustration of how messy history can be.
Right.
We tend to think of the Reformation as this monolithic movement,
Uh-huh.
but in reality, it was full of internal tensions and contradictions. Even Henry VIII.
Yeah.
The driving force behind it
Yeah.
wasn't always consistent in his views.
So the dissolution wasn't just this top-down decree.
Right.
It played out very differently in different places.
Yes.
Influenced by these individual personalities and local circumstances.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of these sweeping historical events, individual agency still matters.
It does, absolutely.
And speaking of individuals,
Okay.
we can't forget the broader consequences of the dissolution.
Right.
While Henry undoubtedly enriched himself,
Yes.
the impact went far beyond the royal coffers.
That's true.
We've already touched on that spiritual upheaval,
Yes.
but the economic fallout was significant as well.
Very significant.
You have to remember, these monasteries weren't just religious institutions. They were economic hubs.
Yes.
They provided employment.
Yep.
They were driving trade. And they were acting as anchors for these local economies. So for the people living in those communities,
Yes.
the closure of a monastery wasn't just a blow to their faith.
Right.
It was a threat to their very livelihoods.
Exactly. And the impact was especially acute in rural areas
Okay.
that relied so heavily on a few large monasteries. With their closure, trade networks collapsed,
Wow.
jobs disappeared, and many communities really struggled to recover.
It's a stark reminder that history isn't just about these abstract ideas and political machinations.
Right.
It's about real people trying to make a living,
Yes.
raise families, and find meaning in their lives.
Absolutely.
And their stories are often woven into the very fabric of the landscape itself.
Yes.
Those ruined abbeys we see dotting the countryside today.
Yes.
They're more than just picturesque remnants of a bygone era.
They are.
They're physical reminders
Yes.
of the dissolution's impact.
They serve as this poignant reminder of what was lost. Imagine those bustling monastic communities.
Oh,
The centers of learning of prayer, of community life,
yeah,
reduced to crumbling stone.
right.
It's a powerful image,
It is.
but it also speaks to the resilience of the human spirit.
You're right. Even in the face of such dramatic upheaval,
Yes.
people found ways to adapt,
They did.
to preserve their traditions, and to forge these new paths.
Absolutely.
And it's in those individual stories that we can find hope and inspiration.
Yes.
We've talked about the monks who settled near each other, the nuns who created these new forms of communal living.
Right.
But there were also those who actively resisted the dissolution.
Absolutely. There were individuals like Elizabeth Schroem
Okay.
and her community of nuns
Yeah.
who continued their monastic life underground,
Wow.
refusing to abandon their beliefs.
Probably.
These acts of defiance, large and small, remind us that even in the face of immense pressure, people find ways to hold on to what matters most to them.
Those stories are so important to remember.
And they are.
Because they remind us that history isn't just about the victors.
That's true.
It's about the people who resisted, who found ways to adapt.
Yes.
And who kept that flame of their traditions burning, even in the darkest of times.
Absolutely.
And sometimes that resistance took surprisingly creative forms.
Indeed, think of the nuns in Sweden who, when forced to attend Lutheran sermons, plugged their ears with wax. It's a small act of defiance, but a powerful symbol of their refusal to conform.
It speaks volumes about the human capacity for resistance.
Yes.
And the strength of conviction.
It does.
Now let's shift gears a bit. And talk about those broader power dynamics at play here.
Right.
We often frame the dissolution as Henry VIII seizing power from the church.
Right.
But wasn't it also about a transfer of power?
Yes.
Within English society itself.
You're spot on. It's crucial to remember that the monasteries held vast amounts of land and resources. When they were dissolved, those assets didn't simply vanish. They were redistributed. And the biggest winners were the landed gentry.
So Henry might have been the one driving the dissolution.
Right.
But the aristocracy was right there beside him?
Yes.
Ready to reap the reward?
Precisely. And it wasn't just about land and wealth. Remember, the monasteries played a key role in religious life at the local level. They appointed priests. They managed parishes and oversaw all charitable works. When they were gone, that power vacuum needed to be filled. And guess who stepped in?
Landed gentry.
Exactly. They became patrons of churches. Appointed clergy. And essentially took control of religious life in their communities.
So the dissolution wasn't just about breaking from Rome. It was also about reshaping those power structures within English society and giving the aristocracy a much greater say in religious matters.
Absolutely.
It's a legacy that's often overlooked, but it's deeply intertwined with the events of the dissolution.
Absolutely, and that's one of the key takeaways here. The dissolution wasn't just a single event. It was a process with ripple effects that continued to be felt for centuries.
It's like a chain reaction.
Yes.
One event triggering a cascade of changes that reshaped the entire religious, social, and economic landscape of England.
And that's what makes studying history so fascinating. It's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding how events, large and small, connect and influence each other over time. It's about recognizing that the past is never truly past. It continues to shape our present in ways we may not even realize.
It's almost as if those ruined monasteries are whispering to us across the centuries. Urging us to remember the lives that were lived, the beliefs that were challenged, and those power struggles that reshaped England.
And those whispers remind us that even the most seemingly solid institutions can be swept away by the tides of history. They remind us that power is always in flux and that understanding the past is absolutely essential to navigating the complexities of the present.
You know, I think that's one of the most compelling aspects of the dissolution. It challenges us to think critically about power, about who benefits from change, and about the long-term consequences of these seemingly isolated events.
Exactly. And it underscores the importance of individual stories in shaping our understanding of history. It's not just about the kings and queens, the bishops and the reformers. It's about the monks and nuns, the villagers and the townspeople whose lives were irrevocably changed by the dissolution. Their stories provide this human dimension
to these grand narratives and remind us that history is ultimately about people.
And it's in those individual stories that we can find moments of courage, resilience, and even humor.
Absolutely.
We've talked about the monks who stuck together and the nuns who resisted in their own quiet ways. But there are also stories like that of the abbot of Glastonbury who, when accused of treason, supposedly hid some of the abbey's treasures.
He did.
In the hope of preserving them.
That's a great example. It speaks to the resourcefulness
Right.
and even the defiance, those who were targeted by the dissolution.
Yeah.
They weren't just passive victims.
Right.
They were active agents,
Okay.
trying to protect what they valued and preserve their way of life.
And their stories, even the small ones,
Yes.
help us connect with this period in a more personal way.
They do.
They remind us that history isn't just this collection of facts and dates.
Right. It's a tapestry woven from countless individual experiences.
Yes.
Each one contributing to this rich and complex narrative of the past.
Absolutely.
It strikes me that those individual stories really bring the dissolution to life, don't they?
They do. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture.
Right.
But it's those personal accounts that make the past feel so tangible.
Yeah.
So relatable. You can almost imagine yourself walking those halls of those monasteries, feeling the weight of history all around you.
Speaking of feeling the weight of history, what do you think is the most enduring legacy of the dissolution? Is it the break from Rome, the shift in power, the economic upheaval, or something else entirely?
It's a question that historians continue to debate.
Yeah.
But I think for me, the most profound legacy is the transfer of power to the landed gentry.
Okay.
Henry VIII might have been the architect of the dissolution,
Right.
but it was the aristocracy who truly benefited. They gained land wealth.
Right.
And perhaps most importantly, control over the church at a local level.
Wow.
And that influence continued for centuries,
You're right.
shaping the religious landscape of England long after Henry VIII was gone.
So in a way, the dissolution laid the groundwork for this new kind of religious authority in England.
It did.
One that was more closely aligned with the interests of the ruling class.
Precisely. And that shift had really profound implications for the development of English society.
Okay.
It's no coincidence that the rise of the gentry coincided with the growth of Parliament and the decline of the monarchy's absolute power. The dissolution, in a way, planted the seeds for a more participatory form of government, even if that wasn't Henry's intention.
It's a fascinating example of how these unintended consequences can sometimes completely reshape the course of history.
Yes, it is.
You set out to achieve one goal, and you end up triggering this chain of events that leads to something completely different.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to study history, not just as a collection of facts and dates, but as this very complex web of cause and effect.
Okay.
The dissolution of the monasteries is a perfect example of how these seemingly isolated events can have repercussions that ripple through time, shaping the world we live in today.
It makes you wonder what those monks and nuns would think if they could see England now.
It's a really thought-provoking question.
Yeah.
Their story is a reminder that even in the face of this profound loss and upheaval, change is inevitable. Right. Sometimes that change can lead to unforeseen and even positive outcomes.
Right.
Even if it takes centuries to fully unfold.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
I think so.
We've explored the political machinations, the economic fallout, the spiritual upheaval, and those human stories that make the dissolution of the monasteries such a compelling chapter in English history.
We've seen how these individual lives intersected with these grand historical forces, how power shifted, how beliefs were challenged, and how the landscape of England was transformed.
Right.
But more importantly, we've seen how the echoes of the past continue to resonate in the present, reminding us that history isn't just something that happened long ago.
Right.
It's this living, breathing presence that shapes who we are and how we understand the world around us.
Beautifully put. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to leave you with this thought.
All right.
The dissolution of the monasteries was a turning point in English history.
It was.
But it was also a very human story.
Yes.
It's a story of loss, resilience, adaptation, and even hope. It's a story that reminds us that even in the face of great change, the human spirit endures.
It does.
And who knows, maybe by exploring the past, we can gain insights that will help us navigate those challenges of the present and shape a better future.
Indeed. After all, the best way to predict the future is to understand the past.
And on that note, we'll bring this deep dive to a close.
Okay.
But the exploration doesn't end here.
It doesn't.
We encourage you to delve deeper into this fascinating period, to seek out those stories of those who lived through it.
Right.
And to consider how their experiences continue to shape our world today.
Yes.
We'll be back soon with another thought-provoking exploration.
Okay.
So don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive.
All right.
Until then, happy exploring.